Good evening, everyone. It's just after 6:30, and thanks for joining us today. We're going to have an interesting discussion, and people are going to be sharing their stories. I am Gail. I'm part of Charm, and also I am kind of supporting a small organisation called Fikaweli, and we're looking at Black-led mental health services, and I'm also a clinical psychologist. In terms of today, we've got about 6 speakers. Paul's going to start and talk a bit about the context of today. And then, like I said, we're going to have a number of service users and representatives and workers as well, sharing their experiences and their views on mental health services in Manchester. Everybody will have 5 minutes to speak, so I do apologise if I interrupt people. I'll do my best to be polite. And if you could put, as Neil was saying, if you put any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll do our best to, to give you a voice afterwards, to express your question. And we're encouraging you really to have that discussion. We don't want to dominate the discussion. So please, have that discussion, raise issues, and so that we can have a shared discussion together. So at this point, I'll hand back to Paul, and just a reminder that everybody has 5 minutes.
So yeah, my name's Paul Baker, and along with some other people, we have been busy trying to think about the way that mental health services and the way that mental health is provided for in the city of Manchester, in Greater Manchester. We got together primarily because we were concerned about the plans to build a new psychiatric hospital on the site of Park House in Cromsall. We had a number of reasons why we thought that was a bad idea, one of which is that we've considered the idea of having a centralised mental health acute unit stuck in one top corner of the city wasn't particularly place-based. But also we had concerns about the nature of acute services anyway and about the way that they're run. And we're particularly concerned with a number of issues that we felt are being perpetuated in the current system to do with services being very coercive and particularly coercive for certain groups. I mean, what I mean by that is relying on mental health legislation for people to have to be in hospital situations, against their will. And also that some of the practices involved, including medication, we feel are too dominant in the model. And we were looking for a more holistic and a more place-based community response. Recently, you'll be aware that the Greater Manchester Mental Health Trust and others, AGMA, and people are talking about a Greater Manchester kind of framework for a transformation in our community mental health services. We've tried to get involved in those discussions and those debates with the commissioners and the providers, but we've been very frustrated. They basically seem to have a very top-down idea of how they plan and how they arrive at what they think is an appropriate service. Having looked at those plans at an early stage, we're not convinced that they would address the problem because it's all based on the premise that somebody has to move within services, and it's very hard to navigate and very complicated. And even though it may work for the services, it does not seem to work for people. So we put together, and we didn't win the argument about not building a psychiatric hospital at Park House, unfortunately. I mean, it's very hard for politicians in this day and age to turn down that kind of level of money. And it's a visible building. And certainly there's no doubt that it's an improvement and will be an improvement on the physical space that it is Park House Psychiatric Hospital at the moment. But it's more than that. We're talking about services, we're thinking about thinking, we're thinking about culture of services, we're thinking about what are we doing when we are supporting and dealing with people in crisis. So to try to come up with an alternative, we came together as an organisation. We brought together people and we created this campaigning organisation that we call Charm, and that's a communities for holistic, accessible, rights-based mental health. And what we did is we put together some what we call our Charm demands, which are part of our what we call cheekily our Charm offensive. So we're trying to play with this game. And the very fact we chose the word charm, we felt there was a kind of certain new energy behind that way of thinking about what we're trying to do. So what we put together, I'm not going to show them today, but I would encourage somebody put it in the chat so you can get the link to the demands. But we've worked through a whole series of agendas and focuses and lenses to think about what makes up good community mental health support if you're in crisis or wherever you are. And we came up with something very different. And what we'd like to do, and our intention, is to find a way of engaging with the commissioners and the services to try to find a way of them understanding that bottom-up planning is as effective as top-down planning. Therefore, we're asking them to think about the way that they are delivering services with what we're calling a root and branch review. So rather than just sort of playing with community services, but leaving acute services principally in the same sort of way, modality, the same kind of thinking, the same kind of way of looking at the way that you meet people's crisis needs, coming up with something completely different, which is based on conversations with people in Manchester about what we think we need and want and how that can be delivered. So it's a shift in the energy. And we've been doing that. We've been reaching out to people like Andy Burnham as the, sorry, move my phone, to talk to Andy Burnham and other people who are important that we can help influence to try to change the conversation about mental health and mental health support. I've said enough, I think, for now, and we will come back to this in the discussion. I'm sure there's bits I've forgotten that I should have presented, and if there are any, I'm sure Anandi will remind me right now. What I wanted to do, though, was to give some energy to the idea that we are experts. The people in this room have knowledge and information, and we have experiences, and we don't believe those are taken into account or given the value or consideration that they deserve. And if that was the case, my belief is, and I think it's Charles' belief too, we could deliver more effective mental health support for people right across the county. So with that spirit, we now want to introduce the discussion to try to find, not only to protest about what is difficult and problematic and challenging about services, but look to solutions and to look to a focus where we can deliver something that's better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And like you said, you've given a really helpful context there in terms of what this evening is about and the value of the speakers and what they have to share, and the importance of the discussions taking place. So now we've got Mary and Simon, who are going to talk about supporting family members who are in crisis in the community. Thank you.
My name's Simon Smith. My story, in 5 minutes, I have to summarize it as best I can in 5 minutes because it's that long-winded and that, exceptional that it does take up a fair bit of time. My brother is 48. He suffers from several mental health and physical conditions. He's suffered the majority of these conditions for over 25 years. It's a long-standing situation that I, sadly to say, my own way of looking at it as his older brother, considering that we have 7 siblings, I've only really been involved in his care in the last 6 years, because before that, as my mother's youngest, he's been in the care of my mother for the most of his life. So my mother, as an elderly Jamaican woman, has been taking care of my brother since he was 20 years old. And even though he has 6 other siblings, we've all just been living our lives. Now, 6 years ago, my mother at 80 became very ill. And then it became very apparent to the rest of the family that what she was doing was way bigger than any of us had realized. And at that time, I got involved and took over the majority of Stephen's care and communications. Now, that situation exasperated me because I work within the NHS. I'm a head chef within the NHS. I do have an understanding of a lot of procedures within different organizations. And when I started taking over Stephen's care, the thing that worried me the most was the lack of communication, the lack of any sort of documentary path of what Stephen has been going through or what the path forward for him was going to be. And I did find that a bit disturbing. And even though his condition was long-term and he had been involved with carers from Central Manchester Mental Health, there didn't seem to be a cohesive strategy in place for how his care was going to be. And it's literally taken me a 6-year fight just to get conversations and just to get things put in place with Stephen. And a lot of it I've had to do myself. I've put in over 3 complaints in that 6 years that I've pretty much come to naught. I'm currently undergoing a parliamentary health service ombudsman regarding my most recent complaint, because I just wasn't satisfied with the round of answers that I was given from the organisation regarding my brother's care. And in all that time, the lack of understanding of what I was going through was even more amazing. And I do think that's another factor of the problem, the lack of understanding from the organizations of the families that are going through this. It just amazes me. And I do get that sensation and that feeling that the organizations will put family members off as long as they can until they just give up the fight and don't make the arguments. And one thing that really amazed me was I thought to myself a lot of the times, if my brother didn't have me to speak out like this, what would have happened to his care? And it's something that has plagued me for a long time, that if I wasn't there, and I've said this a number of times to his coordinators, if I wasn't there to ask these questions, what would have been happening to him? What would have been done? Would he have just been left in a hole somewhere and just left to disappear and no one takes an interest because he has no voice of his own? And the answers and the sort of responses I'm getting is, oh, no, but because my brother's not, and it's the most common statement I've had, because he's not I fear he's not a danger to himself and he's not a danger to anybody else outside, that means he has slipped through the net. And that is my biggest problem, is that statement. Because he's not, according to the organizations involved, Stephen's not been sectioned and his illness is not that severe that he's not tried to hurt himself, that means he's not a priority. Now, as I said, his condition has existed for over 20 years. Now, to me, he deserves better. I can't underestimate as much. He deserves to live. He deserves to have a better quality of care. He deserves to be given an opportunity, even at this stage, to know there is some sort of path forward. Because right now, to me, the situation he was in 20 years ago, he's in that very same situation now, even though he's been given medication and so-called help over that time frame. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for sharing that, and the energy that it takes. And like you say, if the family wasn't there, what would have happened? Really, is the question. Yeah. So we're going to hand over to Mary now to share her story.
Thank you, Gail, and hi everybody. And Simon, that really struck a chord with me. So I also have a younger brother his diagnosis is of schizophrenia, but that's not how I think of him. And he lives not too far away from me in Manchester, and I often think that what would have happened to him if he hadn't had family, and I don't like to go there, and I don't expect you like to go there either. And I think a lot of what I've been thinking about what I wanted to say this evening echoes a lot of what you have said. So I mean that's my family situation, but over the last 10 years or so, I've voluntarily run a mental health support group that's through the national charity Rethink Mental Illness, and that's because I needed somewhere to go and talk with other people who are in a similar situation. I think it can be a very isolating experience, yourself living with a mental health condition or having a family member. So I wanted somewhere that I could go and share my experiences, and so we'd been meeting once a month face to face, and then come the pandemic last year, we shifted to weekly online meetings, and we're a mix of people who, like me, have got family member, but also people with lived experience and people who are going through some really, really, really tough ongoing struggles with mental health. So I was reflecting today about what would I say, how would I try to kind of sum up some of the experiences that we talk about in the group and try and do it justice. And I feel like at the root of so many of the frustrations that I hear and I have personally is not being heard. And family members and individuals not being heard and not being taken seriously and not listened to, and also a focus on medication to the exclusion of so much else that's important. And Simon, you talked about, you know, that kind of risk, almost like that risk management approach. If somebody's not harmed to themselves or others, then they don't necessarily get the support that they need. And so on that not being heard, this kind of things that I hear about is people trying to tell the services that the side effects of their medication or their loved one's medication are kind of ruining any quality of life that they have. And those concerns not being taken seriously or taking so long to be heard. Not being heard about someone being in hospital and not feeling like it is a place where they could get better, and it just being somewhere that they want to get away from, or not being heard, a family member not being heard that hospitalisation might not be the right option for their family member at that time, and why didn't you ask me and why didn't you include me, or not being heard that the accommodation that a person is being offered will just make a situation worse. And I think what this comes down to is about who holds the power in the system and who makes the decisions. And so what I would like to see, and I think so many people that come through the group would like, is to have a stake in the system and not feel outside it and not feel isolated and alone, and like they're trying to struggle against a system that should be working with them, because that's such a waste. It's such a waste. And also for mental health treatment to not just be about symptoms and therefore about stopping them with medication, but about the person, and asking that person, what do you need to feel better? What does your family, what might they think is important for you? And how can we help you understand what's going on? If you're hearing voices, what might they be saying to you that's important? And rather than just trying to make it all go away and squash it and put it in a corner, how can we try and deal with this? So, a system that's not so adversarial, that doesn't mean that you get what you want only by putting in complaints. Simon, you've had to fight. And I think that's what, this group is about, trying to build that community, connecting people together, allowing us to try and work together to build something that is about people and and their families and their community, and not about symptoms. And I think that's as much as I hope that does justice for what people have experienced and told me about. But I think that those are the main things that I wanted to touch on this evening. Thank you, Gail, and thank you, everyone.
I'm conscious that Simon wants to come and just say something very quickly, but also Mary, just to emphasize what you said about the voice and how the impact of isolation and the importance of organisations like Rethink. And like you said, not just seeing people as symptoms, but the whole, and what do the symptoms mean? What are the voices saying? Because they do have meaning and so on. So thank you. So back to Simon, you've got something important to add.
Yes. No, because I was listening to Mary there, and it's another point that I'm saying, because Mary was saying how she found organisations to help her as a family member understand what was going on. This was problem that I found when I first found out how bad my brother's condition was. I never could get any information from the organizations of anywhere supporting groups that I could go to get more information about how to live with this condition. As I said, he was with my mother for a long time, but us as siblings, we knew next to nothing. And it was like there was a blanket of, well, you can read pamphlets, was all that was offered to me. Pamphlets. And I felt, yeah, but you're not educating me and giving me the knowledge. Even though I could consume all that information, which I did, it's still not a supportive way of making me understand how we move forward with my brother's care. And I think that was very lacking as well. And I do understand, and I do agree with Mary entirely. It was a very vast lack of support that you are given when you're in that situation, and you do feel it's all on you because you can't seem to reach out and get any help, and it just seems to be a standard way to everybody by the looks of it, and it is a shame.
Yeah. It is a shame, and that's a massive weight to carry as well. So, and if the service, like you said, the gaps in the services are massive. Really, the gaps are there, and we're left feeling isolated, not burdened, but carrying the weight of issues, which is really important, and not being understood. Thank you, Sam. Now we're going to turn to the worker's perspective as well. Although, like you said, Simon, some of us work for the system as well. And we're going to turn to Claire, who is a crisis worker and also campaigning for the union.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you so much to Simon and Mary for sharing your stories and what's been happening. And it just, it's real testimony to the fact that something needs to change desperately in these services. It's not right that people are left fighting on their own and, struggling with this. And so thank you for everything that you said. I'm a care coordinator in an early intervention team, and I'm a union rep for Greater Manchester Mental Health Unison branch. Our union branch is currently in a formal dispute with our employer, GMMH, and that's about this protracted crisis of underfunding and understaffing, which is actually being made worse at the moment because they're now expanding the service to a 7-day service from 5 without any additional resources to do that. So spreading the already stretched resources even thinner and reducing your capacity further to see your clients. And obviously kind of chronic staffing and shortages and under-resourcing has a significant impact on the well-being of staff who are under a lot of pressure. However, we are acutely aware that the people who suffer most because of this problem are the people who depend on these services. So the people that we're trying to support and the people, their loved ones, and as we've heard today. So what's happening? What's happened to lead to our dispute? So that's basically why our dispute is not just about working conditions for staff. It's about all of us, really. It's about people as a community. It's about defence of public services. It's about the rights of people to be able to access decent care when they need it. So in the teams, we have in the community mental health teams, there are hundreds and hundreds of people on waiting lists for months and months at a time at the moment, right across Manchester, with no access to any help whatsoever. When people are finally allocated a worker, the chances are that care coordinator is going to have double the caseload size than they should be, and that inevitably limits our ability to give the kind of support and the care that we want to give and that we're supposed to be able to give. There's excessive waiting times for talking therapy. People feel under pressure from managers to discharge clients before that they're ready to be discharged. We have a massive crisis of retention, so staff leave because it's really stressful. That disrupts people's care further, and it also adds to the kind of the pressure that the remaining staff face. We know that without the right support, that people's conditions and people's problems can become more chronic, and that there can be, more relapses and higher risk of like hospital admissions and like long-term unemployment and homelessness and relationship breakdowns and all of those things. And as we've heard kind of other speakers say, that when staff services aren't resourced properly, there's a kind of tends to be a more crisis-driven response and approach, and that comes at the expense of more important kind of therapeutic, not more important, but really important for people's recovery, like kind of recovery-focused therapeutic interventions. And those responses can end up being more coercive when somebody's if they've been left to become more and more unwell, so more use of the Mental Health Act or higher doses of medication, which, can be traumatic interventions in themselves. We know from an internal audit in our team in the early intervention services that if your care coordinator has a higher caseload, then that's associated with you being more likely to need to have a hospital admission. In our team, in early intervention teams alone, we've got a shortfall of 37 staff according to NHS England. Now, that's a huge proportion because actually it's only a small team of about 60 staff. So that's 37 new roles that would need to be created if we were to be properly staffed. That's a shortfall of about £1.3 million. Now, we want our employer to use this information that they have to approach commissioners and to say we desperately need more funds for these services. We want them to halt 7-day working until these problems have been resolved. But unfortunately, we've hit a brick wall, really. We've been told that, yes, there are challenges, but we don't agree that there's any evidence of the problems that we've raised, all the things I've just spoken about. Now, bear in mind that these concerns have been raised via collective grievances from every single adult of working age community mental health team in the city and every early intervention team. They've been signed, the collective grievances have been signed by every staff group, so from consultants, therapists, care coordinators, every role. So to come to the conclusion that there's no evidence of a serious problem is really beyond us, and that's why we've now in position where we've had no choice really but to ballot members for industrial action, and members in early intervention services have voted unanimously that that's what they want the union to do. So that's what we are doing. We know that when services are properly staffed and properly resourced, that suicide rates can be halved. We know that recovery rates are much higher. And this is why, our dispute, our industrial action, yes, it's about conditions at work, but it really is about all of us, and it's about the rights that we all have to access healthcare. And it's good to be here today as well, because there's strength in unity. We're hearing about people fighting these things on their own, and it's really difficult, and nobody should be in that position. So if we're united, in fighting for better services, as staff, as trade unionists, as carers, as people who use the service, as a community, then we are formidable then, and we can make things better. We can bring about change. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for any support for our industrial action. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. That's again a really powerful message in terms of it. Like you said, there's a kind of domino effect, isn't there, of the system doesn't support workers, and as somebody's commented here as well, then staff are burnt out, and then that has massive impacts, which you just mentioned about the statistics, very real life impact on individuals. So thank you for that, and your campaign as well.
Thank you.
So now we're going to ask Jeff to share his story, and again, Jeff, we appreciate you sharing your story and also your campaign. Thank you, Jeff.
Good evening, everybody. And thank you for inviting me to contribute. There is no way in 5 minutes I can even give you a sufficient competent insight into the journeys that I've been about to know of. Suffice to note that my husband tragically took his life at the age of 44 a couple of years ago, and had been failed serially by Manchester NHS mental health services. I don't particularly want to talk about that. It's still a little bit raw, and I don't think the information adds to the picture already painted. What I want to share with you is my own journey for trying to seek help for a condition you may well know, bereavement by suicide, which has an exponential risk of self-harm and is considered quite serious, complex grief. And as an innocent, I went down this journey, and I'll share a little bit of the so-called, well, let's call them highlights of the journey that might inform your campaign. My background is I'm a research historian, so I'm a very boring academic. So I'm kind of the nerd branch. I also have a lifetime's experiences of complaints and disciplinary procedures, having sat on various committees, including the National Committee of the National Union of Teachers Disciplinary Committee. And a complaints procedure, as you well know, is an excellent means by which to identify faults with the service and to improve it. So when I was first rejected for treatment by level 2 mental health services run by the Big Life Group, my recourse to action was the complaints procedure, as well as political contacts that I have through a lifetime of local politics. What emerged on this journey, there is some good news. 2.5 years after seeking remedial treatment, I'm finally a level 3+ Manchester mental health patient receiving trauma treatment. So there is some good news at the end of this, but that journey to there has generated 12 formal complaints, of which 8 have been unqualified upheld with apologies and recommendations for improvement. 2 are still with the Ombudsman, and another 2 are pending clarification. Most of the organisations I've come across have dealt fairly professionally, in some cases exceptionally well with the complaints, although maybe with a few prods every now and again. The real problem is the CCG. And I would go as far as to say that the Manchester Health and Care Commission's complaint procedure is bankrupt. It is a corrupt system, to use the jargon. In that, for example, my husband's inquest found that the long waiting lists were complicit in my husband taking his life. And the Regulation 28 was raised with the Secretary of State, identifying significantly long waiting lists as a component to the journey that led to my husband taking his own life. The formal response of that was completely ignore the ruling. That is, the complaints procedure run by Manchester City Council on behalf of the CCG chose not to acknowledge, let alone address, a judicial judgment. Secondly, another complaint that I've submitted concerning my treatment by the Gadham Centre. Gadham Centre, which treated my complaint, 1, by ignoring it, secondly, by suspending their own complaints procedure, thirdly, by abusing me, fourthly, by sharing my medical records with a third party. Need I go on? When I complained to the CCG that they'd signposted this organisation to me, and therefore would they try and get the Gadham Centre to at least admit that they'd stopped doing these things after they admitted to my MP and myself, hands up, they apologised for all those serious malpractices. The CCG turned around and said, we have no responsibility when we recommend NHS patients to outside services. We have no duty of care that organisation to which we refer them to operates in a sound and professional manner. I could give you a lot more examples, but what I'm trying to present here is the suggestion that the main means by which a patient might complain and expect redress for failings they have suffered is not functioning. And it has taken me quite a bit of time to try and work out what this is. And the only conclusion I've come to, which would have relevance for your campaign, I think, is in the reply to my complaint based on a judicial judgment that the significantly long waiting lists were a component part of my husband taking his life. The response was, everything is bright and beautiful. We offer a timely service with the appropriate clinical response. Now, if that is the response, then any complaint must be wrong-headed, because everything in gardening is rosy. There's a logic. I know it's perverse, but there is a logic to this. So if we've got everything right, all it matters when we get complaints is to convince the complainant that they're wrong, because that's the only conclusion you can come to, because everything is right. if anything, if even a scintilla of that is correct, then there is something seriously wrong by the means by which an organisation should seek identification of flaws and address them. I've spoken for 5 minutes, so more than 5 minutes. So as I said, I've tried to select out. I'm just doing a plug, if that's all right, Gail. Dan was a very popular teacher in a school close by, and we set up a Do It for Dan campaign. And there, yeah, thank you, Paul. If anybody would like to support me on my 200-mile walk, Paul had the right page up there. I'm no doubt he'll find it. I'd be grateful for any help. Thank you very much, Gail, for listening.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm conscious of time, but thank you for sharing your journey, which you said has been a very complex one. And thank you for that, Jeff. So now we're going to turn to Amy Wells, who's going to give us a vision, some ideas about what mental health services could look like in the future.
Thank you, Gail. Can everyone hear me, just to check? Sometimes my sound's a bit funny. Thank you for the thumbs up. So yeah, thanks to everyone who's already spoken, and it's nice to see everyone virtually. But just to introduce myself, I'm Amy, and I work for the National Survivor User Network, which is a membership organisation by and for people with lived experience of mental distress or trauma. And I myself have experience of trauma and distress and of various labels and of using services. So I'm going to be talking a bit about what good community care or community services could look like. I think it's important first to touch really briefly on why we need alternatives to inpatient settings, institutionalization, and statutory, which I can never say, services. So things like hospital admissions can actively harm people by not providing a therapeutic environment, taking them away from their support networks and local communities, and sometimes enforcing treatments on people as part of a medical model-based approach to recovery. They often don't seem to understand the reality of our lives, so the social and material and condition and cultural conditions of our lives, like poverty, racism, ableism, and discrimination that can cause distress in the first place. And in many cases, that kind of makes them not fit for purpose, and people can be re-traumatized or discriminated against in the system as it stands, which is underfunded and outdated and can be really coercive. So you're essentially told there's something wrong with you, rather than getting support to address the fact that you're often having a valid response to trauma or something that's happened to you. So in terms of alternative ways of moving forward, there are lots of things already out there that aim to offer an alternative that are great to think about when trying to envision kind of a future of community services. And lots of these things are kind of off the grid, under the radar, rooted in kind of user-led peer support, which is often about grassroots community groups or local kind of voluntary and community sector organizations offering mutual support and safe spaces based on kind of a shared knowledge of distress and disadvantage and needs, where people can be sure that they're not going to be judged or pathologized for what it is they want to talk about. And often these are kind of peer support groups for particular groups of people. So people who have been labeled with the same diagnosis, or people from a particular marginalized community. So they don't have to explain themselves over and over again, like you kind of have to do in the current system. And importantly, these groups that are rooted in the community offer kind of choice about how and when people use peer support and place-based services that are tailored to local community needs. And these are principles that I think we really need to carry forward into the kind of future of community care for people in crisis. So I'll quickly mention the Soteria, I think I'm saying that right, model of crisis houses are quite a good example, I think, of what community alternatives can look like. So these came about in America in the 70s, I think, and in essence, they wanted to develop non-coercive, minimum medication therapeutic environments for people experiencing what gets called psychosis or extreme states. And they did this with houses that had a sense of homeliness and community, and an understanding of where people's experiences fit within the social context. They were staffed by people, I think, with direct experience and people were able to kind of stay for as long as they wanted. There were some studies that showed that they did a lot better than people who had been hospitalized in the long run. There's a UK network, I believe I'll put a link in the chat after this, but there's a UK network that tries to promote this approach, and they succinctly describe it as helping people in crisis by doing with rather than doing to, which is just kind of the essence of it that I really like. And in Leeds, where I currently live, I was born in Wigan, but now in Leeds, we have what's called Leeds Survivor-Led Crisis Service, set up in the 90s by a group of service users who had campaigned for a compassionate, non-medical alternative to like hospital admission and formal services for people in serious crisis. And it currently runs like a moving crisis cafe that aims to avoid attendances at A&E, and something called Dial House, which is a bit like a crisis house, which is kind of, it's described as a sanctuary. It's open through the night. There's the option of like one-to-one support from I think they call it like person-centered support, so more holistic support. There's like a family room, so parents in crisis can bring children. There's no rigid approach to how you use the crisis house, so you can come a few times or you can use it in the more like long-term sense. And they also run a service there in collaboration with something called Touchstone, that's specifically for people from racialized communities and asylum seekers and refugees, that's run by and for workers from racialized communities themselves. So it's an effort to provide a culturally competent service that understands the challenges to well-being faced by people at the kind of intersections of multiple marginalizations. So I think overall, I could go on about all this for ages. I think it's important that because we don't all have the same experiences of distress and there's no one consensus on what might be most helpful, the community provision needs to kind of reflect that need for choice and individualized approaches that aren't currently possible under our really under-resourced system. And there are some really good examples currently out there that could provide a kind of model to evolve into future services rooted in the community, both like locally place-based, but also in terms of like identity and socially, so that you can provide care without power dynamics, basically. And yes, am I over time?
It's fine. The alternative to medical models, or working with is really, really important, and having those social models is the way to go, really, because we're more than, obviously medicine works for is part of for some, and that's really important, but the social aspect of things is massive as well. Yeah. So thank you for that vision, which is what we're hoping for. Anandi. So Anandi is going to be our last speaker for today, and I will let Anandi introduce herself. Go ahead, Anandi.
Thanks, Gail, and thanks to all the speakers before me who've raised so many really important issues. I am one of the founders of CHARM. I'm also an academic, and I am a carer who has gone through many of the experiences that others have spoken about, including having to write to the Parliamentary Health Ombudsman. And it was only after writing to the Parliamentary Health Ombudsman that Prestwich Hospital actually looked at the evidence that I gave them for my complaint. And then that was when I was issued with an apology. And the only comeback for the consultant was that the issues would be raised in supervision. So the amount of distress that was created for me, was huge in terms of, and it could have been dealt with in a much, much better way. But that isn't actually what I want to speak about today. One of the things in setting up CHARM, our argument is that we know that there's a crisis of funding, and one of our demands is that the funding for mental health should be equitable to the funding for physical health, which at the moment it would need to be doubled in order for that to happen. But also it's a question of how the money is spent. Hospitalization is hugely expensive. And what we're seeing happening is that the more that as the crisis gets deeper, we're seeing more people ending up in hospital because they haven't actually been supported much more earlier on in their crisis. And with all of these circumstances that we see, we know that Black people, people from ethnic minorities, suffer greater. And so the thing that I want to focus, one of the focuses of CHARM, is that we really want to talk about the fact that if we're going to create services that are really meaningful for communities, we have to have an anti-racist service. I'm going to start with a story. It's not my story, but this last Saturday, for a research project, in fact, that I'm doing to do with racism and the pandemic, I interviewed a Black nurse. She's now retired. But for the first part of her career, she worked in mental health. And I asked her about the racism that she had witnessed and experienced. And she spoke to me about the fact that she often witnessed Black men being medicated way, way above, a white man, for example. And there were times when she had been able to challenge this, that she would question, why is it someone has apparently the same diagnosis, whatever the value of those diagnoses, the same symptoms and everything else, and yet they're on a much, much higher dose of medication? Where's the evidence for this? And she did, in fact, manage to get some of the people that she was supporting have their doses reduced. And there was one person who she supported in the community who eventually, through this and through the development of her own relationship, with him and his mother, she managed to get him into a much better situation, to the point of when, on the last day of her, before she left the service, this man thanked her and said, I want to take you out for lunch. And she thought that wouldn't be a professional thing to do. But she said, she said, you can cook me lunch. So he cooked her lunch. Now, this might seem a very small thing, but the fact is that he had managed to get himself together. And just as Mary had mentioned, this fact that this isn't just about reducing symptoms, this is about trying to develop the quality of somebody's life so that they can actually do things, relate to people, take part in the world, and the things that I want to think about in terms of Karen's story is, firstly, if we want to change the service, we have to recognize that racism exists. Currently in Greater Manchester, I have found it very hard to talk to anybody within the service that is prepared to actually address this. When I first came into contact with mental health services, when my own family member ended in crisis, and I went to a presentation by a psychiatrist from the early intervention team, who talked about some of the indicators for why you might be more susceptible to becoming psychotic. And there was all kinds of things in there, sexual abuse, migration, being a second generation migrant, all sorts of things were mentioned. But he didn't have racism on there. So I said, oh, you mean racism? Now, this particular person was so shocked that I'd actually named it. They didn't know what to say. You can't have a service and people working in a service that can't even articulate the word. There has to be a change in the system. And we know the evidence is there in terms of the way in which Black people are treated. Black men in particular, 4 times more likely to come into contact with services through the criminal justice system, 50% more likely to be prescribed depot medications, which indicates some level of coercion and force, more likely to be held in collusion, on average, likely to remain in hospital twice the length of a white British patient. We're not just talking about a small impact. We're talking about something that is absolutely huge. And yet, when we have, as CHARM, spoken to GMMH in a meeting that was arranged, and we mentioned this, we are met with a blank wall. So 1 is recognize racism. 2 is, if we look at Karen's story, we can all make a difference. Karen stood up to the consultant that she was working with, who she was able to discuss and, and make a change through. Now, I'm not saying that this is always the racism isn't always in relation to that dynamic. It could be in relation to many numbers of different dynamics within the system. But the point is that it is incumbent upon us all, whether we are people working in the system, white and black, whether we are carers, or whether we are the service users. When we see it, we have to call it out. Racism is supposed to be a crime in this country. It's illegal. If that is the case, why is it these injustices are going just not dealt with? The other issue is that if we have a system that challenges racism, if we have a system that is an anti-racist service, in order to do that, if we want that, we need to have a system that rethinks what mental distress is about. That system cannot prioritize a medical disease model because it has to recognize that actually it is societal inequalities, it is trauma, a repeated trauma of racism. The microaggressions are also macroaggressions. I'm never quite sure why a microaggression is called a microaggression. I find the term hugely difficult since they can have incredible impact on people's lives, or whether it's structural, all of these things. This is about society. It's not about someone's problem in their brain. So it's just their response to the trauma that they have found, that they have encountered. Now that means that we need to find a new way. We need to find a new way to organize services. We need to find a new way of thinking about mental distress so that we are putting people at the center. We're putting the relationships at the center so that we can challenge the terrible racism and blatant stereotyping that happens within the system. And that's why Charm's demand is building a service that is about relationships, about supporting communities, what communities want, about developing psychological and other interventions that recognize complex and intergenerational racialized traumas. And some of that can happen much more effectively in the kind of spaces that Amy was talking about, in the sort of Soteria houses, in Black-led services, that kind of thing, that involves the powers that be disseminating, reorganizing some of the structures of power that exist. I want to finish by mentioning the last of, it's not actually a Charm's demand, it's a statement. So we went through the acronym CHARM, and we've got, holistic, and we've got a list you'll see on our website, and then we've got accessible, rights-based. And at the end, under mental health, we've made a short statement. And that short statement is very important to us because it's about recognizing that it is our responsibility as a society to hold those people that have suffered as a result of the inequalities of the system that we live in, namely a capitalist system. It is the system that has created these problems, and it is therefore our responsibility as a society not to label these people and stigmatize them and see them as a problem, but to see this as something that we have to sort out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nandi. And as Anandi said, she is the co-founder of CHARM and obviously is very passionate about the systems that we know and the use of power within those systems. And thank you to everybody who's spoken today and shared their experiences of mental health systems in Manchester in terms of the impact on ourselves, on family members, on workers and so forth, and the impact of inequalities in services as well, which compound the experiences of emotional distress and add to that sense of, add to experiences of trauma as well. So now we're going to open up. I was trying to type there just to say, please put questions in the chat, but I ended up sending the message directly to Paul. But as a message to everybody, please put some questions in the chat, and we're going to open up now for discussion. Go on then, Andy. So
I just wanted to say is that please put questions in the chat, but please also put statements in the chat. Put what your concerns are in the chat, because this is our first public meeting and we want to take up all kinds of issues to try to change things in Manchester. So the more we know about what the issues are for people, for everybody, the more that we can do what, in a sense, communities want. So please, even if someone else has mentioned something, feel free to mention it again, because we'll get a very good idea then of what the issues are.
Thank you, Anandi. And yes, feel free to express as well, if you feel comfortable, to share your views and to speak in this meeting as well. Some of the issues that came up, one of the issues I saw was about the psychological abuse of power that systems can do, in terms of how systems can abuse power and how that leads to inequalities and so forth. But also the important link to statistics. So it's not something that's been made up, it's a reality. I didn't know, I wondered if anybody wanted to comment on that in terms of the psychological abuse of systems and how they can promote inequality, how they can not see and not hear voices as well. You can raise your hands, I think.
Is it all right if people do it in the chat, actually, rather than raising hands?
Okay, sorry, yeah.
We had one question from Simon.
Yeah.
I don't know if he wants to ask it. It's Simon Smith, if he wants to unmute himself. If not, I can read it out.
Please read it out. Is that the one where I was just asking about the American system? Which one was that?
Yeah, about looking at other countries.
Yeah, I'll get back to him. You see, what I was considering, like I said, I'm not a specialist on mental health. I've only really taken this up since my brother. But my query is, Americans seem to take mental health a lot more serious. I understand that their funding is a negative side, being private funded organizations, but they seem to be taking the stigma of mental health totally away from their society. They address it directly and it's integrated into a lot of their working relationships. Why does the UK seem to constantly live on the stigmatization of mental health problems?
Yeah, I want to just come back on that one. I agree with Simon that I've some of the most interesting and innovative examples of community mental health support, particularly from a peer perspective, I found in the States, and particularly on the East Coast and the West Coast. But I think with every country, the problem is none of these things are little gems in a desert. That's the problem. And I go back to what Amy said before, is that, yeah, these are great ideas, open dialogue and Satiric House. The thing is, the challenge is to embed them into the system, not to be kind of ad hoc locked onto an existing system. And that's what they seem to do. We're going to grow this thing, which is kind of a monster almost, because at its heart, it's contradictory. There's so many contradictions. And what's the psychological relationship to the psychiatric perspective? How does that work? And I think what we're trying to say is shift the model from kind of biopsychosocial, which is the kind of understanding, to eco-social, community. Psychological is there, and so is bio, but it's a kind of shift of energy. And we know that, if we don't clean the air, people are dying of particles on Princess Parkway. There's all sorts of agendas. Green spaces make a real difference to the quality of our resilience and energy that we have. So, we need to understand that. Also, we need to shift the system, which is driven by the idea that there's a disease process and people need meds, to something else, which acknowledges social determinants and oppression as working as an operating thing that actually is very challenging to individuals and causes weathering, which also includes this psychological weathering, body keeps the score. We can't handle it. And some of us, in the face of that, we need a lot of support to get our resilience and our sense of identity, our meaning and our purpose back. And we do that through community. So that's what we're trying to challenge services to pick up the true agenda that was in the Transformation for Mental Health Green Paper, or whatever they call it, the guidelines, which actually says create informal spaces. Don't spend the money on more bureaucracy and more signposters. We want the things. You know, we had enough of this pointing all over directions. We want another system that's designed around community and ownership. So that's what I've got to say. Simon, so thank you for opening that. And I have actually gone to the States and looked at these organisations, and are, to a certain extent, Charm owes some of its heritage from some of those experiences. So I acknowledge that. On the other hand, it's a very deeply capitalist system. And if you are vulnerable and you've got a mental health problem, you could well be shot. So, you know, we know that too.
Does Franklin want to unmute himself? Or does he want me to?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I think from when I had problems in the past, that the system tends to write people off. It tends to think you should be medicated, and then you can't really cope with these problems and do other things that work, for example, whatever you might want to do. You just got to be medicated to be kept quiet, and that's the end of your life. And that's my impression. Do the panel think that's unfair?
Well, thank you, Franklin. Yes, and we can't do that. And there's some other questions here. There's one about giving thoughts to youth services, and if we have any thoughts about that. Does anyone have any thoughts about youth services in terms of the context of what we've been speaking about, and I guess also in terms of prevention?
So I could say a little bit about that. I mean, I'm very impressed by things like 42nd Street, which is an NGO based in Manchester. I mean, there are very good examples of projects which are trying to develop and inform psychological support for young people. But unfortunately, again, the same system applies. We've got kind of competing models. You've got the kind of early intervention teams and CAMS, as they call it, children and adolescent mental health services. And quite often they have a very ADHD kind of labelling kind of energy. And I think what we're seeing again is a contradiction. We need a root and branch. If you look at this and come back to see what we think is working and what is not working. I mean, we're very concerned at the moment about electroconvulsive therapy. And when we found out that in Greater Manchester, it has the 4th highest usage of this particular treatment in the country. And when the medical director responded to the Evening News article, they were defensive. They said, nothing to see here, reflecting very much what Jeff was telling us before. Everything is rose in the garden, nothing to see. When they were asked specifically by the journalist, Seamus, about what about consent, they said, well, you know, that's not fair. We don't centralise. We don't know if you've got legal consent because it's too hard to find that information. However, they did find enough energy and time to challenge the findings of the research themselves. So they're very odd about the way that they deal with this. So we're looking for openness. Going back to young people, I think one of the things that we understand is that, you know, like through the Hearing Voices approach, if you can get to young people when they have these experiences, the trajectory and the journey is much more positive and open than if you end up in a psychiatric service. So we often find that for many people, if you can follow the child, it's a very positive way to work. You know, youth services, schools, families all play a role in this, I think. So that's another thing that we would like to do, is have some consideration of the needs of children and young people. And I think we need to make sure that's in Charm demands as well.
And that's very true. Having worked across child mental health services as a psychologist and worked in adult mental health services, you can almost see you can almost predict how things are going to be, which is very, very sad. It's very, in terms of the system. There've been a number of comments around autism and waiting for services and funding, and that's a comment by Katie. I don't know if anybody wants to talk to that, or if Katie wants to say something.
Mm-hmm.
It would be good if Katie just summarised the kind of things that she's been mentioning, and then.
Yeah, I can do. I'm just for background. I'm actually a mental health nurse working in Manchester. I'm here to try and sort of, I guess, figure out if there's things that I can do, that because I came into this profession because I wanted to make a difference after surviving my own mental health issues as a teenager, and surviving undiagnosed ADHD for a really long time and untreated ADHD, and not finding out I was autistic until I was 31, and things like that. And last year I self-referred into IAPT, who then said I was too complicated for them because I was shielding and experiencing something very close to agoraphobia around the time that the first lockdown was supposed to end. Here we are, like nearly a year later. They referred me on to a specialist autistic or charity for providing counselling for autistic people called Respect for All, which is an absolutely amazing charity. Doesn't get enough funding. That was in June last year. And the last time I checked, around about a month or so ago, the CCG hadn't even looked at my referral. And I'm told that there are people who've been waiting for 3 to 4 times longer than I have. That's 3 or 4 years for counselling that's desperately needed. And I've had counselling with Respect for All about 2 or 3 years ago after I was diagnosed, and they helped me to learn self-compassion rather than hating myself for all the things that were different about me to neurotypical people. And I immediately thought of them when I said I was too complicated for them. I said, well, could you refer me on to this service so that they can help me with like readjusting back into society again? And it's almost a blessing that we just have lockdown after lockdown, because I'm still sat here waiting. I'm now actually looking at I've now had the all clear from occupational health to start returning to work, but I don't, I just wish I had that support there available. Fortunately, my managers are being quite good, but it's I can't believe that there's people waiting for 3 or 4 years for that kind of service that they desperately need. And it's awful as a professional as well, because I really want to make a difference. And when I had the support that I had, I lived in London, and it was before the 2010 general election, so I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into. I had an idea once as I was graduating, but certainly as I was starting my training in 2013, I didn't really know like how badly underfunded services in the north, away from South London, and obviously now with the Tories in power as well, I didn't know how bad it was going to be. And it is really, really draining sometimes, because you want to make a difference. Like, didn't come into this for the pay, I guess. It's which is the other kind of the big thing that we're fighting at the moment. But it's really, really draining, because you want to make a difference and you want to help, and you want to not be like the jaded staff that have already been working for 20 years. But I just don't see any way that I can help sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to come back on that one briefly, just to say that we did put a freedom of information request to ask how long the waiting list was, because I have a family member who's also looking for an adult assessment of autism, and I eventually got the finding there's 603 people on the list in Manchester, and they do 30 assessments a year. So you could literally be waiting 20 years for an assessment. The way the 3-year, 6-month things, they will fast track certain people who are complaining the most. So the only way to get a faster thing, but that pushes other people further back. And I guess people just give up.
Yeah, I was extremely fortunate, because at the time that I got my autism diagnosis, I had a GP in Salford, and they were paying for private referrals. But I know that Manchester, the Manchester Autism Service, that I think it's based in Trafford, is, for a long time has not even had a consultant. And that's part of the problem.
And again, we never know that. We never hear that. They keep that to themselves. And the issue here is we don't have an autism service in the city of Manchester. But further, it seems to me that they knew that this waiting list is as long as it was. So there's no parity with physical health on any basis at all. It should be 3 months. I mean, that's ridiculous. So they've also signed up to be part of something which is called the Greater Manchester Autism Friendly. And it just makes a nonsense of that rhetoric. If they can't actually even assess people to see if they've got a need, they can't even do that. So how can it be friendly if you can't even get your understanding of yourself acknowledged? It's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, from when I was extremely I suppose I have a suspicion that when I had my referral, that it was part of the reason that it was as fast as it was because I was actually referred by my ADHD consultant, who the conversation essentially went him saying to me, and because you're autistic as well, and I said, no, I'm not, and he just looked at me and said, yes, you are. And then he referred me for an assessment so that it could be written down on paper that I was, or that I am. And like I say, I had absolutely no idea because I have masked my autism for so long. I'm actually non-binary and they them pronouns but somebody who was socialized as female growing up, and I had to learn to hide my autism, and it's just I thought I was just weird and different,
Thank you, Katie. And like you said, the waiting list and the way that services are set up just adds to that distress. And it is a crisis. You mentioned the North, and it is a crisis in Manchester and nationally as well. I know around autism there is a crisis. And even when there's a diagnosis, the support after that isn't really there, and it kind of falls on the voluntary sector to carry everything. So thank you for that, and we could hear the level of distress that has caused. Thank you for sharing that. In the chat, there's a couple of issues that have come up. There's drug and alcohol services being denied mental health support. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on that, or Debbie, if you'd like to say something about that. I'm conscious that we have about 10 minutes left.
I'm quite happy for somebody else to come in with things, really.
Yeah, well, it's important to highlight that, isn't it? So that drug and alcohol services are not getting the mental health support.
Quite often because of the medical model of mental health services, you've got professionals who say, well, we can't give medication because they see that as the only option that's available for people with drug and alcohol, and they don't want to give medication because of the drug and alcohol. But that is because of the narrow field of sphere that the mental health services have got to as part of their tools. But also that it's a discrimination as well, because that could be the cause of the drug use, that people are self-medicating a lot of the time. And some cultures as well are forced to go towards alcohol services or to go to detox as the only option when there's a mental health. And when they do come out or they get clean or they give up alcohol, they're not getting the support that they need.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's been a kind of repeated message, hasn't it? We're not saying we know that medicine can be very helpful, but I think what we're saying is sometimes there's an over dependence in the system on medication and that medical model, which unfortunately can be very hierarchical and does function in terms of status and so on. And unfortunately, communities, individuals, families can end up feeling quite disempowered. Okay.
Yes, Gail, I just wanted to come in on that, and in terms of that medical model, and there's been some discussion as well about young people, and but now we know that there are other ways forward that have really good evidence base for success. I mean, one of them is open dialogue, which involves creating, if you like, a therapeutic space with the person in distress and their family and close contacts. And you would think that, particularly for young people, that should be the first, if you like, port of call, rather than putting people on medications that can have devastating effects on them. And yet there's absolutely no access to practices like open dialogue in Manchester. So, you know, Charm is asking, well, why not? Why can't we access these new transformative approaches in the city of Manchester? Mm-hmm. Instead, are we spending 125 million on a hospital, which is also going to actually remove the only recovery ward that was in the previous Park House? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, a lot of questions.
And Anandi, you talked about well, there's that theme of medication, and you talked about over medication of Black men in particular, and racism. And I've just wondered if anybody wanted to. I saw a couple of comments about Black men and their treatment in the systems, and I just wondered if anybody wanted to comment on that.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me when you listen to almost all the stories that people have told of their experiences is just how many people have serious levels of distress and trauma and don't get any help whatsoever from official mental health services, and that there is too many barriers to people to jump through to get to them. But even if they manage to pass through those barriers, which generally we make as hard as possible with multiple assessments and sort of criteria, the sort of service you get when you get there isn't always the service that you want. And therefore, some people don't even try, or some people try, and then when they get there think, actually, this isn't what I want. And it's just frustrating when you think that, A, there is quite a lot of money goes into a mental health, nothing like what's needed, but there is, and a lot of that is at the end of hospitals, sections, locked wards, secure units. They take the biggest bulk of the funding, and they deliver a really horrible service for people who probably wouldn't need that service if you did lots of other things before that. They only need it because you've ended up failing people before that and not delivering. And I think that that's an important thing that we need to note, that it's not just that we need more money, and I desperately think we do need more money. There are people who have been accepted for treatment, and there just isn't the staff to deliver that treatment. But I also think we have to look at what sort of treatment and how we're delivering it and how that works. And I think that partly has to say we need to have a society that removes some of the things that makes people ill. We used to call it benefit-induced illness, was one of our diagnoses, sort of, and is still one of my diagnoses, that if you're on benefits and you have to go through the horrible system, it's a humiliating experience deliberately. It's a very time-consuming and it's a very frustrating system, and it makes anybody feel distressed and unwell. And if you already start unwell and before you get in that process, you're likely to trigger more unwellness. And yet we put most people through that. And the numbers of people who are on no money whatsoever and don't claim anything because the process is so awful, and then have to live with the poverty of that and the inability to access anything else, is just horrendous. And so I think there's something about the way society works that makes mental distress much more common and insecure. But I also think we don't then deliver anything like the sort of service that we need, and we don't listen and focus on what people need, because we're driven by protocols and rules. That means that we have to push people through sausage making mental health machines, and I work in part of that, and trying to resist doing numbers and forms and sort of, you know, the right sort of system is a very difficult thing to do as workers within the system, knowing that it's not, you're not doing what people want always, or you have to somehow try to fiddle to do what people want, but try not to let your managers know that you're doing it, is a horrible game to have to play. And I think that's one of the crises that I think people just don't acknowledge is happening at the moment.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And yes, it is really important. As you say, the systems can unfortunately compound the trauma, and unfortunately are set up in a way that doesn't promote good mental health and just strains the system, individuals and workers and so forth. And like you said, unfortunately then practices might change to benefit individuals, to benefit families, which sometimes place the workers at risk, and that shouldn't be the case. Okay, so we've got a few more minutes left. I think when I got cut out, I was just talking about black men, and yes, I would acknowledge and agree. I think somebody said that unfortunately the situation with black men has been going on for 40 years plus, which is why I'm part of the organisation Fikaweli, which is about black-led services. Okay. So yes, there have been some really brilliant comments, and somebody said that's been a brilliant meeting, and I really think we thank everybody who shared their stories, and we don't take those for granted at all. And that what your experiences have been. Anandi is holding up her hand.
I just wanted to say before everyone goes is that Charm has a sort of organising meeting every 4 weeks, and we usually put the date on our blog, and everybody's welcome who wants to get involved in trying to change the existing system. And let's just all make a noise together and do something about this.
Thank you, Anandi, as a co-founder of Charm, and the other founder, Paul. Paul, I don't know if you want to sort of say something to end as well.
Yes, I'd just like to say I found the meeting really fascinating and useful. I thought the comments that came through, what the contributions, particularly from the panelists, was excellent. I've got sitting next to a person here saying that's gold from a filmic point of view, because it's so clear and the messaging is so obvious that there is an issue here. So let's insist, as Jeff said, that let's not caught up in their dysfunctional complaint system where we get caught up in a kind of spiral where a vicious circle where we're going nowhere. Let's be vigilant. Let's scrutinize what they do. Let's be their critical friend. And let's lead them to another space that we know they want to be. And remember, institutions are made up of people, and people change. So I'm very clear that I'm optimistic and I'm positive. It's difficult now. I know they're trying to reach out to find a way to engage with us because they're not used to this kind of organisation in Manchester, or quite often in any part of the country, really. So the combination of citizens, people with direct lived experience, our social networks, our friends and our families, and workers together is a very powerful mix. And if we can go together, I think we will find ways to change what's happening in our county. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. Please continue the conversation in your workplaces and in your homes and in your social spaces. And also just let us know if there's anything else that you would like us to do. We've got a website now. We know they look at it. We've got connections in the media, and we want to promote campaigns, and we want to get busy. A new one that's coming up is this thing called SIM, which I'm learning about. Thank you very much from the Greater Manchester Coalition for Disabled People and others related to this, which is this kind of fusion of policing onto people who've got no criminality in their lives. I need to read more about it, but there's continually, we're seeing things which we need to challenge and find alternatives to. So on that note, thank you very much, everybody, and I'll hand over to Gail to close the meeting.
Yeah, it's just to say again, thank you for everyone, and it's powerful. It's been a very powerful meeting, and I do feel that there is power in numbers, and we've come from it. We've come to the conversation with different identities, but very similar issues, and a theme of disempowerment. And as Paul was saying, it's about there are individuals and that there is scope for change, but the system is the thing that we need to think about as well. So thank you. I know there's a comment about if there'll be a video available.
Yes, we'll put it up on the website, and we'll effectively this event will be available for anybody who wants to see it or show it to friends, and we will well be using elements of this for our film that we want to produce. But if we do use anything that you show, we will ask you first. So we won't just use it without
Might not listen to you. We'll ask you.
Okay, all right then. So let's close the meeting then. So thank you, everybody, and we will have further meetings. So keep in contact and come along to our meetings in the future. Thank you very much. Hopefully a physical one, a physical meeting. So bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you, panelists.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.